So from hockey ref to founder himself to now ice cream connoisseur, you're just all over the map, really.
Yeah, and we were lucky enough, and for the unfortunate people inside Campus Labs who, on their resume, had worked at Anderson's before they came to Campus Labs. we relied on them a lot in those early days of the ice cream machine. So.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever you may be listening, and welcome to Latitude, the 43 North podcast. I'm your host, Nate Benson, Director of Media and Public Relations here at 43 North, and we have a jam-packed show for you this week. We have Campus Labs CIO Bob Willer on the show this week. It's going to be fantastic. Bob's got a fascinating background, so I don't want to waste too much time setting it up because he tells his story way better than I do. But he went from being a professional hockey referee to a CIO of a pretty substantial startup here in Buffalo with over 200 employees. They make waves in the education space. They're in a lot of colleges across North America. Bob gives the figure in the podcast, so I don't want to spoil it too much. But it's a really fascinating story, and it's, I think, pretty inspiring for those about ready to make career decisions and how you make those career decisions, how you let passion drive what you're doing. Again, Bob does a really great job also mentoring one of our 43 North companies, Kangaroo Time, and he's helped other companies in the past as well, and he's really big into giving back to the startup community. So I don't want to waste any more time setting this show up, and let's get to this week's episodes with Campus Labs CIO Bob Willer.
I'm as prepared as you are, so this ought to be good.
What's fantastic is we're both equally unprepared. Bob, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Nate.
Fantastic. For the audience members who don't know you, why don't you give us the quick pitch of who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Bob Willer, and I'm the VP of Technology and Operations down at Campus Labs. I've been working in technology here in EdTech for probably close to 20 years, been at Campus Labs for 11, and working the last couple of years with 43 North, helping mentor a couple of the different companies that have come through here.
Went to UB and SU, I believe, right?
I went to both of them, and ironically enough, I work in education for as long as I have. I did not graduate from school. Life events took me in a different direction, and kind of worked my way back into education. So,
how did I guess what was that journey working back in then, especially early, right? When would you have graduated, I guess is the question.
So I would have I graduated high school in 84 and then would have graduated college in 88. But at the time, what had happened was I was also playing hockey at the time. Broke my leg playing junior hockey in Rochester. Came out of that and, kind of knew my playing career was over. Not that I was going to have a playing career anyways. I wasn't that good. But, coming out of high school, you look at how to earn money. And one of the things that I realized is that I could make more money refereeing hockey games locally than I could working at McDonald's or somewhere else. And so I worked a lot of hockey as a referee, and eventually, just because of timing of what was going on in the NHL at the time with expansion and things like that, got picked up by the NHL as a referee, worked on their staff for 4 years. So that's when I left school. So I was essentially a pro hockey ref for close to 8 years. But during that time, I carried a laptop with me. One of the things I like to tell people is that, if you're a player on a team, and a pro team, you play half your games at home and you travel with 20, 30 other guys during the rest course of the year. But as a referee, you're on the road solo all the time. And so you need stuff to do. And I also knew, you hear a lot of stories about players, especially kids that are playing junior hockey, and what happens to them after their junior career is over if they don't get picked up or they don't play. A lot of those kids have nowhere to go because they're billeting in Canada and have no profession really to lean back on. And so I knew, that was always out there. So I always carried a laptop with me. I love technology. My godfather ran the networking team at UB for a long time, and I remember as a young kid sitting on his lap over at Ridgely in the old computer center there, looking at the green screen playing tic-tac-toe, thinking that was the greatest thing in the world. And as the evolution of technology, the Apple II came out, and it was just a great time to be in that space and learn. I self-taught myself how to program and learn about technology, and so I had something to fall back on after my officiating career was over. So,
your officiating career, was this during the peak of the glow puck or not?
The glow puck was definitely part of that. It was actually peak. NHL official stripe. So if you remember Donut Gate with Don Koharski and Jim Schoenfeld, and that time period, it kind of happened during a time when expansion with Florida and San Jose, and those teams came into the league. So it was definitely an interesting time in the league at that point. So. And coming out of that, I actually wound up working for Ronnie and Jordy at UCANL. So that's kind of the dovetail back into the technology world.
That was my next question.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I worked, coming out of being an official, my wife said, "Okay, you got to get a real job." And luckily, I had some skills to lean back on. And
that was a real job. Sorry.
And so my first real job coming out of that was working at UCANL, which eventually became Client Logic, run by Jordy and Ron. So that was kind of my introduction to those two. Worked directly for Paul Bandrowski, who kind of had some early history here in the Buffalo startup community coming out of all that. So that was.
Yeah, I was going to say, for those out of town listeners, those are all Jordan Levy, Ron Shriver, huge names in the early entrepreneurship scene here. So, what was that? I mean, why? I guess from officiating, why not still stay in that sports realm, whether it was coaching or something like that? How did you, you said you carried a laptop around, but I guess take the audience through, what carrying that laptop around actually meant. So, like, what were you working on?
I've always just been writing kind of software on the side, and, it's not too different than a pro athlete who retires, and you think about life for a little bit and go, okay, what's next? And what's the opportunity? And I was still young enough to know that I had to think something more long term. And it was a skill that I had, and it was actually something that I loved doing. So it wasn't something I needed to go back to school for and get a degree in or do anything. I think at that time, the web, a lot of people don't realize that the web wasn't the web back then.
It was
the
wild,
internet,
wild west.
Right, and it wasn't until 1995 that you could actually conduct commercial business on the internet. And so coming out of that, writing HTML and doing that thing was brand new, and nobody else was really doing it. So if you had any skills at all,
you had a job.
You had a job, right? And I was lucky enough to work for a few people there at UCANL. One of which actually came. They had done an acquisition of Alexander Lord, which was out in the Valley, and a couple of those folks left UCANL to do another startup in Silicon Valley, and I was the first person they hired out there. So I was knee deep in the startup community in Silicon Valley at that time, which was just, was an amazing place to be. Go out in Palo Alto and in the mid 90s and the late 90s. And our office out there was right across the street from what at the time they were building the campus for Silicon Graphics, which became the Googleplex. So I watched that whole place get built, and just to be in that scene at the time was just amazing. And you get that, once you get a taste of that, that's why, just to fast forward a little bit, coming back to what's going on here, it's just, it's in your blood at that point.
So I guess, I can fast forward a little bit. And we'll get back to your path of entrepreneurship, but like comparing the Silicon Valley rise of the mid 90s to kind of what we're seeing in cities like Buffalo, and I won't single Buffalo because a lot of cities are doing it. Raleigh comes to mind as well, but kind of walk us through like what that experience was like and what you're experiencing now.
Yeah, I will say the scale is definitely different. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the Valley, even back then, to try and find a place to live, for example, is just outrageously expensive. Sure. And so everything is inflated. The competition for talent was insane, and it still is. I mean, if you hear all the stories about what's going on in San Francisco today, and how, just the diverse left, big money and the people on the street, so to speak, is just, there's such a gap there that, you're really, communities like Buffalo and Raleigh or whoever, I hope really look at that as a tale to say, let's make sure that we don't have that happen. Let's make sure that, if we can create jobs in a thriving tech community, it's not at the expense of everybody else. It should help the entire community. So I hope people kind of look at that and go, hey, this should be a good thing for everybody, not just 10% or 2% or whatever that is.
So how long were you out in Silicon Valley for?
So I was out there I actually lived here in Buffalo and commuted out there once a month. So I'd spend a week or two out there every month. And that startup eventually got acquired by a company called Quarterdeck down in Marina del Rey. Quarterdeck was an interesting story, and I learned a lot of M&A kind of lessons there. QuarterDeck, for people who remember it, were famous for QEMM, the memory manager for the early PCs. But they also had one of the first web browsers. So they could have been Mosaic or Netscape at the time. But they went down a path of acquisition that really bloated the company and buying too many things, so they had a lot of cash to burn. And so QuarterDeck eventually, kind of under that weight of all those acquisitions they did, got acquired by Symantec. And so my path was Silicon Valley to Marina Del Rey, up to Oregon with Symantec, and I was actually the last employee formerly employed at QuarterDeck, worked at Symantec for a little bit, and then once they kind of trailed off that acquisition stuff, I wound up back here in the Buffalo region just doing some consulting work. Consulted for Xerox, and then I met a couple of other entrepreneurs here, Dave Marshall and Kevin Guyton, who had founded a company called Cyber Design. And they were a web design boutique that they had started out at the University of Dayton, asked me to join them as a consultant to build the online registration application for UD. So you think about a big, giant university building their online course registration process for all those students was a pretty big project. We launched that. That had some challenges, and due to some back end things that we were tying into. But at the end of the day, it was fairly successful, and it was probably one of the first online registration programs that people now just take for granted. But Dave and Kevin said, "Hey, do you want to come on full time as an employee?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love to, but I don't want to be a services company." So at the time, they were more design focused, and they were necessarily software focused. So what we did is sat down. I wrote the business plan for a company that we ultimately called Liquid Matrix, and built it as a software company. And then that got us back into doing some of the fundraising as a startup here in Buffalo. Sold that company to Datatel, which is now Ellucian, one of the largest players in the ERP space and in the education space, which, to make a long story longer, got me connected with Eric, because after we sold to Datatel, I was talking to our recruiter and said, "Hey, if you happen to know anybody in the Buffalo area that's looking for a CTO, that's in the higher education spot, that's kind of like a startup," and he said, "Got the guy for you." And so that was my that was my introduction to Eric, and that was 11 years ago. My first interview, we probably chatted for an hour, and of that hour, 45 minutes we talked about hockey. So
that sounds like a very typical Buffalo interview.
Yep, absolutely. So
I want to go back to something you said when you were still kind of working in the Valley, that you would essentially work remotely, right? You were working remotely from Buffalo and go to, working remotely is kind of a big alluring factor for a lot of startups now. What was that like back we're talking mid-90s, right?
So it was 90s? Kind of mid to late 90s. So it was probably 97, 98 in that time frame.
Very somewhat archaic, I guess.
Yeah. So it was early on. At that point it was post dial-up, so you could get hardwired lines, and but it was a lot more expensive than it. So you had to do special like DSL lines and things like that. So it wasn't exactly okay. We've got a big fiber connection, and it's just like you're being there. It was definitely a little bit different, time zone differences and things like that. So, the whole remote worker conversation is actually an interesting conversation in its own. We talk a lot about it at Campus Labs, and whether or not we prefer people to be in-house versus, there's distributed companies. We even talk about it with Kangaroo Time here. So there's just special things you have to know. You actually have to work harder as a remote employee. Yeah. You're not there kind of showing what you're doing. So you've got to put in that extra effort to make sure people see your value without actually seeing you, so to speak.
Well, even now, I think we all take it for granted. You just fire up Slack and you're in the office, so to speak, and none of that existed. Even Instant Messenger was somewhat early stage, probably in the mid '90s. So
correct, yeah.
So fast forward. I know you went through your journey. What's fascinating about your story is you mentioned, how school didn't necessarily work out, but you ended up in the education space for so much of your career. Is there anything to that? Like, is it just kind of like you stumbled into and like you stuck with it? Like,
no, it was by accident more than anything else. But I love learning, which is a little ironic considering. But we talk a lot about even when Chris Hively was here last week, we talked a lot about what are the schools teaching in the programming space, right? And back then it was like, UB was teaching Modular 2. but I don't know if there's a company in the world that was ever using Modula 2 as their programming language, right? So to me, education at the university level wasn't so much about learning technology skills that I could apply in a job as much as it was about learning how to learn, right? So how do you go find this information? This was pre-Google, right? You couldn't go say, okay, I've got a programming problem to solve. Let me see what X, Y, or Z says about it. You actually had to go figure out and learn it on your own. You might hope that there was a book or a magazine out there about it, but what school really taught me was how do you go learn on your own as opposed to actually teaching a set of skills.
So Campus Labs, walk us through. We had Eric Reich on the podcast before, so dig into our archive and listen to that episode. But for those who might not do that, give us a quick rundown of what Campus Labs does and how large of a scale that you guys do it in.
Sure. So Campus Labs has a very interesting history around what they're kind of focused on from a problem-solving perspective at schools and institutions. And I give for all of our incoming new employees, I actually give the Campus Labs history talk. So I think probably, I don't know how many companies actually do this, but we sit down all of our new employees once a quarter, and I give a conversation around the history of Campus Labs. And it's really important to orient the new employees about where we've been, why we do the things that we do, how the acquisitions that we've done over time fit in. So Campus Labs is, at the end of the day, it's a software company that works in higher education that's focus is on providing data and information back at the school so that they can provide better outcomes for the students. And we do that through data collection, data analysis. We do that through a lot of applications that end users use, whether that's on the administrative side or the student side. So we touch 3-4 million students. We work with 1,500 schools, mostly in the U.S., but a pretty big footprint in Canada and the rest of the world. So, the work that we do is really important in that. At the end of the day, having a job and working in technology is one thing, but having a mission as to what you're actually working on is really important. So loving what you do is hugely important.
Do you love what you do?
I absolutely love what I do. Not only do I love what I do, I love the people I work with. And it's one of the great things about Campus Labs, just the people is you're never going to be the person who walks into that office and is the smartest person in the room. And so as a person who loves learning, to come in and have all the PhDs that we have and the just wide range of people that we work with on a daily basis, it's fantastic to come in and sit and just say, hey, let's have a conversation about this or that and learn from everybody that you have there.
So for those who might not be familiar, what is someone in your position doing kind of on a day-to-day basis? Is it driving the technology in which the company is using? Walk through that.
My role at Campus Labs has shifted over time. So when I was originally hired, I was essentially the CTO. I was brought in to run both the technology, internal IT, and development. And that was kind of my role for the first 5 or 6 years until we started to have conversations around acquisition. And Eric and Michael decided, had enough inbound interest that we've decided that we were going to sell the business that we ultimately wound up selling to Hire One. And during that process, what happened was, because we were a small startup, and when I was hired, it was probably 12 to 15 people at this time.
So you got in early on.
Yeah. And so, and I think Eric tells that in his podcast. He talks that it took a long time to get from 0 to 10 people and 10 people to where we're at today of 200. That's a 15-year time frame. And that's just the case of how higher education does business. If you're going to do a startup and you want to grow fast, education is probably not the place to do it.
Well, because it's a long sales cycle, because they're dealing in budgets on a yearly basis. So, like, if you don't get in the right time in, say July, you have to wait a whole year before you get back to that school.
Yep, and it's a very defined size of market, and nobody in education moves fast. So, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, it's a solid market. I like to tell the story that when we did Liquid Matrix's startup, we were fundraising right when the bubble burst, and so getting money
it's a good time for that.
Oh, it was fantastic. But what the investors eventually saw and came back to us and said, hey, wait a minute, none of your accounts receivable are past 30 days. And, oh, by the way, schools never go out of business. And so it's a very solid place to do business, and it's a very forgiving place, too. They all talk. It's unlike if you work in banking and you've got something cool that you're doing, you don't tell your neighbor. Right. In education, they talk about everything that's successful, which really is helpful. So I forgot where we were back on.
So kind of how you started out day to day.
So day to day. So as we got to that point where we were going to sell the business, Eric and Michael, as with most startups, have had a lot of third parties that were helping them around finance and accounting and legal, and so we were dealing with a lot of outside people, and nobody internally at a company that size is doing things like KPIs and looking at the kind of answering the questions that acquirers really want to know. And so there was nobody to do that work, and really what happened is Eric and I rolled up our sleeves and said, okay, we've got to put together enough information and data not only to show how the business operates today, but what it's going to look like next year and 3 years from now and 4 years from now. And so we did a lot of that work, and I'd done a little bit of that with Eric as we'd done some of our early acquisitions and looking at on the M&A side and how some of that looks. So my role really morphed into more of an operational person, almost as kind of going from CTO to CIO, and looking at things like budgets and run rates and where we're going to be in 2, 3, 4 years, because people are, making $1 million gambles on what we're telling them essentially. So we sold the business in 2012 to HireOne. We were with HireOne for about 3 years, and my role during that 3-year period was interesting. That whole time period, I think, for most people at Campus Lab, especially at the leadership team, was interesting. I reported directly to the president, working more on initiatives around new business and kind of product side more than anything else. But as HireOne had their struggles, they had to sell us back off in 2015, so we went through the whole process again,
Right.
pitched to 8 or 9 potential acquirers, had to put the books all back together again and do exactly the same thing. And when we came out of that, luckily, Eric's got a great eye for talent, so the leadership team stuck together through that. The person who ran software development, Sean Townsend, is a great developer and a great leader, so he just took over software development when we went into HireOne and kept it coming out of HireOne. And now my role is really about operational things at Campus Lab. So I manage all the budget, HR, finance, all the contracting work, the move to the new space. So acquisitions, a lot of M&A work, because that's how we grow the business. Really, is M&A now.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of detail more than anything else. Less tech, although I still run internal IT, but you get to a certain scale, it somewhat runs itself. Knock on wood.
So you're in charge of the snacks over there at Campus.
Yes. So yeah.
For those who don't know, the best cafeteria in Buffalo, bar none.
Yeah, great story behind that. So Eric last year gave the sales team a target and said, "Listen, if you hit your number in 2017, I'll buy you an ice cream machine." What that really meant was that Bob has to go figure out how to get an ice cream machine into the cafeteria.
Like any good leader makes a promise that someone else has to deliver.
Yeah, so me and my operations team, Jess Coleman and Jill and Lindsay, who work on the HR side, we learned a lot about ice cream. We learned about, there's not a lot of difference between ice cream and custard and yogurt and gelato. And
it's usually just temperature.
It's actually got to do
sugar
with
content.
sugar and the amount of cream that's in it.
Yeah.
And which machines make which.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's just an example of the things we do.
Yeah, so from hockey ref to founder himself to now ice cream connoisseur, you're just all over the map, really.
Yeah, and we were lucky enough, and for the unfortunate people inside Campus Labs who on their resume had worked at Anderson's before they came to Campus Labs, we relied on them a lot in those early days of the ice cream machine. So,
do you find yourself doing much development anymore? And I only ask because that's a language in itself, and like any language, if you don't practice that language, you lose it. So I'm curious, like how you kind of get into the nitty gritty to hone your skills, if that's something you even want to still do.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I still love software development. I still do it on the side. I've got a couple side projects. One of the things I did with HireOne, which really, I think was one of the most helpful and interesting things I did while I was there. HireOne, for people who don't know, was a publicly traded financial institution. And so the rules and regulations around what they could and couldn't do, but the cybersecurity side of that was a giant part. And their chief security officer left, and so I filled in his shoes for probably close to a year as the ISO there, chief security officer. And so taking a security focus on the technology side was really, really interesting and really important. And actually, the first thing that I did to transition to the 43 North side was help the 1099 painless guys last year with some of their security challenges and things like that. And Kangaroo Time this year one of the very first things we looked at was security there. And to anybody who's starting a company, never roll your own security. And that's I will just tell everybody that, because you're probably going to do it wrong. And 1099, we kind of walk through that. Kangaroo Time, we walk through that. So
you still dabble.
I still love writing code, and it's I kind of do a little bit here with Kangaroo Time just because it's fun and I miss it a lot. So
it kind of gets me into the next topic of mentorship and kind of paying it forward, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Why obviously quite successful. You have a full-time gig with Campus Lab, so which probably requires a lot of your time. But I see you working with Kangaroo Time quite a bit. Hopefully Eric's not listening, so he's not checking the books. But why get involved? Why roll up your sleeves and help a startup?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to that. One is just on the mentorship and helping and things like that. I think if I go back to my days in Silicon Valley and a lot of people will read or see the stories now of back then, pre-IPO companies, that people worked 24 hours a day, slept under their desk, never left, and that's not necessarily the most healthiest of scenarios, but just coming down here and getting that vibe and feeling that level of excitement and wanting to be part of that is certainly part of that. I think if you think about community, things that you can do to help the community, help what's going on down here, just in general, it's a good thing to do, and I enjoy doing it. But the second part, I think, just on the KT side, is just a personal relationship that I've gotten with Scott now. Very much what I saw in Eric and that entrepreneurial spirit, and just hit off a personal connection there. Our first meeting that got set up was supposed to be 30 minutes. It went 2.5 hours. And so we've just been kind of talking as friends more than anything else since then. But to be able personally to get back into the technology side has been just a lot of fun for me and kind of reinvigorating. So,
but why? I guess for even broader speaking, what would be your advice to folks in a similar position, you with 20 plus years of experience in startups and development and being a chief of a startup? Why get involved? What would that message be?
It does you no good just to keep it to yourself, right? If you can help others, I think there's a message there that if anybody thinks about their journey, right? They had people who helped them along the way, and so it'd be nice to be that person that people point to and say, that person really helped me as I was trying to do something. Or if you can do something to help a company solve a problem, why not do that? It doesn't cost you anything. It might take a little bit of time, but it's just what people should be doing. I think the bigger challenge isn't so much the lack of people who want to help,
right,
as it is how do I actually get involved in the first place, right?
Because it's intimidating. You don't want to just randomly call some company you don't know and like, hey, I know this. Do you need help? Like, because it's just like getting a first date. You don't want to call the girl.
Right. And I'd said to Eric once Eric worked with Z80 for a little while and then got involved with 43 North on the board. And I told him, I said, hey, listen, anytime I never thought about this in a mentorship perspective more than I thought about it as, hey, I'll come down and do speak. I'll come down and if anybody wants to talk on security or building a dev team or whatever we want to talk about, I would love to come down and help in that fashion. And then just getting kind of thrust into the mentorship side this year has just been, it's been exciting.
I want to talk about, because you kind of took the DIY approach of learning all this, which is admirable, and it's fantastic. What should students be looking at now when they're looking at school or just looking into a field of infotech or technology or development? Like, where should they be looking that's going to be the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we run into this a lot in the interview process, right? When we're looking at resumes from kids who are coming out of school, and I will tell you what really differentiates the resumes that we look at is, sure, you've gone to school and you've got a 3.8 GPA, and I don't care whether or not you went to ECC or you went to UB. But if all of it says is that you've got coursework on your resume and you've built a compiler, that's not going to stick out to me, right? What will stand out is if you took that and then you applied it to real world open source projects. So you went off and you've contributed to other projects, or you've built some things on your own that maybe aren't open source, but you can show that you're trying to apply things that you learned in the classroom to the real world. And that's where we're trying to work with the schools to say, hey, let's look at what your curriculums look like to help those students actually know what the jump from classroom learning is to working on a team and doing commits and learning how to architect things from that. Okay, great. You can build something that 3 people use, but can you build something that 1 million people use? Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, that is the biggest difference between resume A and resume B. So get some real world experience, whether that means you're interning or you're, like I said, helping in the open source community or whatever, but that's the biggest thing. And the technology side of that, there's so many different ways you can go today, whether that's programming or VR, AI, data science. Smart people are smart, and I always like to say that when we hire, I don't really care what language you know. If I know you're smart, I know you'll learn something, right? And so that's what we really look for is how smart are you? And for us at Campus Labs, it's really important, can you communicate? Because we're really about sitting next to each other and talking and being open. And when we do interviews, and when I used to do interviews around on the technology side, I'd be pretty open with the candidates and say, listen, there's 2 types of environments. You can go work at a traditional software shop at a bank or an insurance company and sit in a cube and put headphones on and not talk to anybody. That's one style. Some people love that, and you get fed your projects and kind of you just work through it. Or you work in an open environment where you have to communicate and talk and throw ideas around and bounce things off and do those kinds of things. And so at the end of the day, some of that is just what's your personal preference and how you like to work. Do you like 9 to 5? Or do you like a world where maybe your hours are a lot more flexible and you have to work harder some days and you get some more flexibility on other days?
Well, I think it's great what you said, because it's really never been more affordable to produce technology or produce an app or produce something for the web than it is now. I mean, doing it when you were doing it, it was, like I said earlier, somewhat archaic to try to even get a quality DSL connection. So I think that's fantastic. Like, just you're looking for candidates who produce something, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that actually with mentoring here at Kangaroo Time that Scott and I sat down and chatted about was, okay, you've got a bunch of developers, and people can hire developers whether or not you hire a team here or you offshore that to somewhere else. Finding developers is one thing. What you really need to find is the people who know how to design and make it look nice and usable by the end user and create that love. So while it may run counterintuitive, one of your first hires in that case almost always should be some sort of UI UX person. We at Campus Labs, actually very early on, our UI UX hire to developer ratio was probably 1 UI UX to every 3 developers. And in fact, when we got acquired by HireOne, they were a very traditional, their CTO at the time and their CIO at the time had come from banking, very old school, and they just could not understand how we would have so many UI people on our team. They were like, well, just put a coat of paint on it and throw it out there.
Banking was always known for having high quality looking websites.
Yes, exactly. Now, and that's why. It's just because they had no idea the concept around what user experience really
functionally
meant.
They worked, but they were just awful.
Right. So bringing in a UI UX designer to Kangaroo Time ran counter to what people thought, because they figured we have to go build all these features and fix all these bugs and build all this other cool stuff. I'm like, but it doesn't really matter if your people at the end of the day are going to leave it after using it for a year, because it just doesn't look good.
What was Scott's feedback on that?
Scott understood, and Scott was very. Scott's been great because his ability to process, listen, understand, and take those lessons and apply them have been fantastic, which makes mentorship really easy. If you tell people and they don't follow through on what you're saying or don't agree with you, then kind of what's the point at the end of the day? It was kind of convincing the rest of the team when they said, listen, we've got these 4,000 issues we've got to fix, and you're telling me we're not going to hire a developer. That was a bit more difficult conversation. But when you walk through the process and say, listen, if we do this right, those 300, 400 support tickets go away because half of them are because the UI doesn't make any sense or because people can't figure out what they're doing. And not only that, but it'll make your job easier because now you're not designing. They'll give you the designs, you apply the logic behind the scenes, and it'll make your life easier. And once people kind of saw I see what this gives us, that made things a lot easier.
So wrapping things up, I want to go back to your hockey officiating days. Can you wrap us up with one of your more memorable stories or something that general public would remember, and what your experience was going through that?
So I was never on National Hockey League ice during a regular season, so I got the opportunity. There's kind of the funniest story I've got around that was we would oftentimes, if we were working like in the IHL, which was a league out in the Midwest, if we were working, say, Milwaukee, Peoria, or Fort Wayne or something like that, we'd stay in Chicago, and if the Blackhawks had a home game, you'd be the backup official. And every NHL game has a supervisor at it. And so I was the backup official at the old Chicago Stadium one night. And Matt Pavlich was the supervisor that night. He's in the Hall of Fame as a linesman. And he says, "Willie, come on down. We got to go down and measure the ice." And I looked at him. I'm like, "What?" I thought for sure he was pulling my leg. And sure enough, down, a couple hours before game time, before the lights come on in the old Chicago Stadium with the beautiful organ, I'm down there with a tape measure, measuring to make sure that, so every so often, they would make sure that the home team side of the ice wasn't shorter or longer than the visiting team side of the ice, so the home team wasn't getting an advantage. So you'd actually go down and measure the distance from the goal line to the blue line to the red line, and make sure they're the same on every side of the ice. And that was one of the stories one of the things about being in pro sports is that people don't realize that it's a business. And if you spend time behind the scenes, especially in the NHL where the general managers have so much power, and you hear some stories about what happens up in the press box and those things, but if you really see what happens behind the scenes, it's people's lives, right? Your calls on the ice cost people jobs at the end of the day. And so you get very cognizant that this is a business. And if you are at Maple Leaf Gardens or the old Montreal Forum, I was lucky enough to get to all the original 6 buildings except for MSG in New York. You just appreciate how important the business side of that, because it's big, big, big dollars. So
I would have been drunk with power. That's why I love the 43 North judging. Because when we rehearse for it, I sit in as the judge when we're doing AV testing, and I tear into these startups. It's fantastic because again, drunk with power. You can't give me any authority. It's not good.
Yeah, it's spending. You spend some time off the ice with professional athletes, and then most of those stories you can't put in a podcast.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was 18, 19. I was the youngest guy on staff, and
wow.
I wish I probably would have had a few more years of experience in just real world to lean back on, but it was a great time. I mean, as an 18, 19-year-old, traveling to every city in the U.S. and Canada, whether that was San Diego and Phoenix or Prince Albert, which is about a stone's throw from the North Pole. It was definitely an experience. So
my brother's a guitar tech for several well-established bands, and he's always kind of saying to me I'm in Tokyo today. I'm just so exhausted. I'm like, you really need to enjoy the moment, because when you get to be our father's age, 60 something, you're going to look back like, wow, that was the best time of my life. I can't believe I did that, and living, like you said, it's like, wow, looking back at that, it's quite incredible. 18-year-old kid, officiating hockey.
Yeah. And when I came coming up through the Coast League, in the early days, Coast League now is, a lot bigger today. Steve Carlson, who was one of the Hanson brothers, coached in Johnstown. So, you go into Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and that rink is exactly like it was in the movie, and they still had the flag up there with the fan blowing on it, and the games at that time were not much different than the movie Slapshot. And so I actually got to be friends with Steve, which was kind of cool. His son played junior hockey, so he came up to Buffalo a lot, and I run into him every once in a while. So you run into a lot of the quote unquote characters of the game also. So it was kind of a lot of fun.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you rather for joining us on the podcast. If people want to connect with you or learn more, how could they do so?
That's a great question. I will make sure that we put my email address or some way to contact me. I don't know if I have other than LinkedIn.
Find you on LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way. I don't have a public page or anything like that right now. So
there's pros and cons to that. I finally have gone dark a little bit too.
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit more reclusive and shy, so I'm not a person who's got a very high public profile.
A true programmer.
That's true. That's true. I prefer the quiet and the dark.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today on the podcast.
Absolutely, anytime.
Cheers.
Thanks.
I want to thank Bob so much for being on the podcast this week. Again, if you want to learn more about what he is up to, just look him up on LinkedIn. He's there, and he's very responsive. He's always big into giving back and communicating with folks who just ask him questions. And as you heard in the podcast, he certainly has a unique background and a lot of experience that he can share with the world. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast this week. Make sure you subscribe on whatever podcasting platform you listen to, whether that be Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Stitcher Radio, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you're subscribing to Latitude, the 43 North podcast. And if you have a couple quick minutes, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review of this show. The more people who leave reviews, the more people who will see this show. And make sure you share it with a friend if you have time. They make it really easy these days. Just hit the share button on your cellular device and share the show. Thank you so much for listening. For 43 North, I'm Nate Benson, and we'll see you at the next one.